an agenda. I sometimes go to the studio and write on the floor, you know.
Eric Clapton is widely known as one of the greatest guitarists in rock and blues history. People call him Slow Hand and consider him a living legend. He's been inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame 3 times, which shows just how respected he is in the music world. Most fans know him for beautiful songs like Layla and Tears in Heaven, but there's another side to his story that many people don't know about. Behind all the fame and musical genius, Clapton has had some very difficult relationships with other musicians. These weren't just small disagreements or professional differences. These were serious conflicts that sometimes lasted for decades. The tensions, rivalries, and feuds he had with other rock stars actually helped shape the history of rock and roll music. Some of these battles were so intense that they affected entire careers and changed how music was made. Clapton once said there were times in his past when he thought about giving up music altogether because it felt lonely. This gives us a hint about how complicated his relationships with other musicians could be. The man who could make a guitar sing with such emotion also had a temperamental side that led to bitter arguments, jealous outbursts, and long-lasting grudges with some of the biggest names in rock history. These stories reveal a side of Clapton that goes far beyond his public image as a gentle blues master. They show us a man who was fiercely protective of his musical territory, sometimes jealous of other musicians' success, and willing to engage in public battles over artistic differences. The conflicts happened in recording studios, at concert venues, and played out in the pages of music magazines for everyone to see. The battle over musical direction with Phil Collins. One of the most surprising rivalries happened in the 1980s between Clapton and Phil Collins. This feud was especially shocking because it started when the two men were actually working together. Collins played drums on Clapton's 1985 album Behind the Sun, and even helped produce several songs on the record. Most people would have expected them to get along well since they were collaborating so closely. However, during those studio sessions, serious problems began to develop. Clapton was a blues purist who believed in keeping music raw and authentic. Collins, on the other hand, was having massive commercial success with his pop-oriented approach, both with the band Genesis and in his solo career. He wanted to steer Clapton toward a more radio-friendly, commercial sound that could reach a wider audience. Clapton felt like Collins was trying to change who he was as an artist. He reportedly complained to close friends that he felt like he was being packaged like a commercial product. He said that Collins wanted to turn him into some kind of pop act, but that wasn't who he was and never would be. For someone who had built his entire career on blues authenticity, this felt like betraying everything he stood for. The tension between them reached a breaking point during the famous Live Aid concert in 1985. While television viewers around the world saw a successful performance, they didn't see the heated arguments that were happening backstage. Clapton wanted to perform with raw blues power that would showcase his true musical identity. Collins pushed for more radio-friendly arrangements that would appeal to the massive global audience watching the concert. People who worked in the music industry at the time said that Clapton later referred to this period as selling his soul. The commercial success that came from following Collins' direction felt like it came at the cost of his blues credibility. While Collins continued to ride the wave of 1980s pop music to international stardom, Clapton pulled back and worked to re-establish his connection to his blues roots. Their relationship got even worse when music critics gave mixed reviews to the albums that Collins had helped produce. Many blues purists accused Clapton of abandoning his musical roots just to achieve success on the charts. This criticism hurt Clapton deeply because his blues identity was so important to him. The rivalry between Clapton and Collins represented a classic battle that still happens in the music industry today, the conflict between commercial appeal and artistic integrity. Creative tension and explosive fights with Ginger Baker. The relationship between Clapton and drummer Ginger Baker was one of the most volatile in rock history. They worked together in the legendary band Cream, which was one of rock's first supergroups. Despite creating some of the most memorable music in rock history together, their personal relationship was explosive and often destructive. From the very beginning, the chemistry between Clapton and Baker was problematic. They had backstage fights that became famous throughout the rock world. The situation got so bad that Clapton once told a roadie that either Baker had to go or he would leave the band. These weren't small disagreements about music. They genuinely couldn't stand being in the same room together. Robert Stigwood, who managed Cream, revealed in a rare interview that the problems went far beyond just musical differences. He said that Clapton thought Baker was unstable and impossible to work with, while Baker believed that Clapton was compromising their sound just to achieve commercial success. Both musicians had strong opinions about how their music should sound, and they couldn't find a way to work together peacefully. The tension became so severe during their 1968 farewell tour that witnesses described seeing the two men barely acknowledge each other when they were performing on stage. Even in the recording studio, they often asked to record their parts separately so they wouldn't have to interact with each other. This was unusual because most bands record together to create the right chemistry and sound. What made this hatred particularly tragic was that despite their personal animosity, Clapton and Baker created some of rock's most incredible music together. The creative tension between them actually helped produce masterpieces, but the cost was the destruction of any possibility of friendship or even basic professional respect. This showed how personal conflicts can both fuel creative genius and ultimately destroy the relationships that make that creativity possible. Baker later claimed that Clapton was actually scared of him and knew that he was the better musician. Clapton responded by refusing to participate in any Cream reunion if Baker was involved. He maintained this stance for decades, only briefly reuniting with the band in 2005. And even then, people who worked with them described the interaction as professionally polite at best, with no real warmth between the former bandmates. Philosophical and musical conflicts with Frank Zappa. The feud between Clapton and Frank Zappa represented a clash between two completely different approaches to making music. This wasn't just a personal dislike. It was a full-scale war between different musical philosophies that played out in public interviews, during concerts, and even in album liner notes. Zappa was known for his experimental approach to music and his satirical, often mocking attitude toward mainstream rock. He made no secret of his contempt for what he called Clapton's predictable blues noodling. In a famous 1978 interview with Rolling Stone magazine, Zappa said that Clapton was a safe guitar player who played the same thing over and over again. He claimed there was no danger, no risk, and no real art in Clapton's approach to music. Clapton was furious when he heard these comments. He responded through music journalist friends, saying that Zappa wouldn't know real music if it bit him. He claimed that all of Zappa's experimental work was just noise that was designed to hide his inability to play real rock and roll. This exchange showed how deeply both musicians cared about defending their artistic approaches. The conflict reached a dramatic peak at the 1969 Love and Peace Festival, where both musicians were scheduled to perform. Sources close to the production claimed that Zappa deliberately scheduled his experimental set just before Clapton's more traditional blues performance. He allegedly told the festival staff to, "Let's see him follow that," which was clearly meant to make Clapton's performance seem boring and predictable by comparison. Throughout their careers, Zappa would often mock Clapton's guitar solos during interviews, calling them predictable pentatonic exercises. Meanwhile, Clapton dismissed Zappa's work as pretentious and unlistenable. Their musical feud represented a larger divide that still exists in rock music today: the battle between traditionalists who value established forms and experimentalists who want to push boundaries and create new sounds. Clapton remained committed to blues authenticity and the traditional approaches that had made him famous, while Zappa continuously pushed musical boundaries and challenged listeners with the unexpected sounds and structures. This led to a mutual contempt that lasted for decades. Even after Zappa died in 1993, Clapton notably declined to make any public comments about him, allegedly telling friends that he had nothing to say that wouldn't be inappropriate. Personal betrayal and professional jealousy with Keith Richards. The rivalry between Clapton and Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones was particularly bitter because it involved personal betrayal along with professional disagreements. This feud was so personal that it included love triangles, accusations of betrayal, and decades of public criticism and sniping at each other. The roots of their animosity can be traced back to a complicated love triangle involving George Harrison's wife, Pattie Boyd. Clapton famously fell in love with Pattie while she was married to Harrison, who was supposed to be one of Clapton's best friends. When Clapton eventually won Pattie away from Harrison, Richards publicly condemned the move, calling it a snake move that showed Clapton's true character. This wasn't just about music anymore. It was about loyalty, friendship, and personal ethics. But the personal drama was just the beginning of their conflicts. As guitarists, their styles couldn't have been more different, and this led to professional jealousy and criticism. Clapton was known as a technical blues master who prided himself on precision and skill. He reportedly mocked Richards's looser, more intuitive playing style during studio sessions, suggesting that Richards wasn't as technically accomplished as he should be. Richards responded to these criticisms by calling Clapton boring and predictable in multiple interviews. He suggested that technical skill wasn't as important as feel and attitude, and that Clapton's precise approach lacked the excitement and danger that made rock and roll truly powerful. This represented a fundamental disagreement about what made guitar playing truly great. The feud became even more intense during the mid-1970s, when both musicians were struggling with serious substance abuse problems. Richards accused Clapton of hiding behind heroin use, while avoiding facing the realities of the music industry. Clapton shot back that Richards had been playing the same 5 guitar riffs for 20 years and hadn't evolved as a musician. Their rivalry extended beyond personal attacks to professional jealousy. When Clapton released successful albums in the late 1970s, Richards allegedly told his band members that anyone can play slow, Eric just hasn't figured that out yet. This was a direct attack on Clapton's more contemplative, blues-based approach to music. Clapton retaliated by refusing to appear on any project where Richards might be involved. The tension between them was so intense that their mutual friends had to plan separate events to avoid putting them in the same room. Even record labels tried to avoid pairing them on compilation albums or tribute projects because everyone knew how much they disliked each other. The Ultimate Guitar. God rivalry with Jimmy Page. The rivalry between Clapton and Jimmy Page of Led Zeppelin was perhaps the most significant professional conflict of Clapton's career, because it represented a battle for the title of Britain's greatest guitarist. This wasn't just competition, it was a fight for the crown that would determine who would be remembered as the most important British guitar player of their generation. Their conflict began on the early days when both were working as session musicians in London. Page was already making waves with his innovative studio techniques and experimental approaches to recording. He reportedly mocked Clapton's more traditional blues approach during recording sessions, telling producers that Clapton needed to expand his musical horizons if he wanted to stay relevant. When Page formed Led Zeppelin and Clapton was performing with Cream, their rivalry exploded into a much larger conflict. Music journalists of the time described how Clapton would privately become upset whenever Page's technical abilities or innovations were praised in the press. A studio engineer remembered Clapton saying that Page was hiding behind studio tricks and effects, and challenging him to play the same way in live performances without all the technological assistance. The tension reached its peak when both bands were touring the festival circuit and often performing at the same events. Page's theatrical, almost mystical stage presence contrasted sharply with Clapton's more straightforward blues approach. The British music press made things worse by constantly comparing the two guitarists, with Clapton allegedly refusing to read any articles that mentioned Page. Paul Samwell Smith, the former bass player for the Yardbirds, revealed some important insights about this rivalry. He said that Clapton couldn't handle the fact that Page had taken the Yardbirds and made something much bigger and more successful than what Clapton had accomplished with them. This success ate at Clapton and created what insiders described as a long-lasting inferiority complex. What made this feud particularly painful for Clapton was that Page seemed to surpass him both commercially and artistically. Led Zeppelin's musical innovations and massive commercial success overshadowed much of Clapton's work from the same period. The band's combination of heavy rock, folk influences, and experimental studio techniques created a new template for rock music that was more influential than Clapton's traditional blues approach. Even in interviews decades later, both guitarists would subtly criticize each other's playing styles and approaches to music. Clapton would suggest that Page's innovations weren't as substantial as people thought, while Page would dismiss Clapton as being stuck in the past and unwilling to evolve. Their rivalry represented the classic conflict between traditional mastery and innovative experimentation. The most devastating rivalry, Jimi Hendrix. At the top of all of Clapton's rivalries was his complex and painful relationship with Jimi Hendrix. This wasn't simply hatred, It was a complete crisis of identity that shook Clapton to his very core and changed how he thought about himself as a guitarist and musician. In 1966, Clapton was widely known as God among British guitarists. He had achieved a level of respect and admiration that few musicians ever experience. Then Hendrix arrived in London, and everything changed overnight. Clapton attended Hendrix's first London performance and was reportedly devastated by what he witnessed. People who were there described seeing Clapton leave the venue with a white face, muttering, "It's over, I'm finished." The famous jam session at a London club in October 1966 became legendary in rock history. During this session, Hendrix completely dominated the stage with innovative techniques and approaches that Clapton had never seen before. Clapton reportedly said, "You never told me he was that bloody good," before walking off stage in what appeared to be a mixture of admiration and complete defeat. From that night forward, Clapton's relationship with Hendrix was characterized by deep professional jealousy mixed with grudging respect. Pete Townsend of The Who recalled that Clapton couldn't handle having his position as the top guitarist taken away from him. He said that Eric went from being slow hand to second hand overnight, which was a devastating blow to someone who had built his entire identity around being the best guitarist in Britain. Clapton's behavior toward Hendrix revealed the depth of his complex feelings. He allegedly refused to attend Hendrix's concerts and would change radio stations whenever Hendrix's songs were played. In private conversations, he admitted that Hendrix had ruined guitar playing for everyone by expanding the possibilities so dramatically that other guitarists felt inadequate by comparison. Glenn Johns, a veteran of the music industry, remembered that Clapton became obsessed with Hendrix in an unhealthy way. He would study Hendrix's techniques intensively, then publicly criticize them while privately trying to incorporate them into his own playing. This showed how conflicted Clapton felt. He knew that Hendrix was doing something revolutionary, but he couldn't publicly admit it without undermining his own position. The ultimate tragedy of this relationship came when Hendrix died in 1970. Clapton reportedly refused to make any public comments about Hendrix's death, but years later he admitted in interviews that he had actually felt relief when Hendrix died. This was a shocking admission that revealed just how deep and complicated his feelings about Hendrix really were. It wasn't just professional rivalry. It was the painful recognition that he had been completely surpassed by someone who had rewritten the rules of guitar playing. The legacy of rivalry in rock history. These rivalries and feuds weren't just backstage drama or entertainment for music fans. They actually helped shape the entire course of rock and roll history. The conflicts pushed all of these musicians to evolve, improve, and create some of the most passionate and innovative music of their careers. Sometimes the greatest art comes from the most intense personal conflicts and the desire to prove oneself against formidable opponents. Whether it was Hendrix's revolutionary playing style that dethroned Clapton from his position as Britain's guitar god, or the bitter battles with bandmates that fueled some of Cream's most explosive music, rivalry and conflict seemed to follow Clapton throughout his career. These relationships show us that even the most talented and successful musicians are human beings with complex emotions, insecurities, and competitive instincts. The stories of these feuds reveal that the music industry has always been a place where artistic vision, personal relationships, and commercial pressures create volatile combinations. The tensions between staying true to one's artistic vision and achieving commercial success, between respecting tradition and embracing innovation, and between personal loyalty and professional advancement have shaped countless careers and created some of the most memorable music in rock history. These rivalries also remind us that great art often comes from conflict, competition, and the desire to surpass one's peers. The creative tensions that made these relationships so difficult were often the same forces that pushed these musicians to create their most powerful and lasting work. In the end, both the music and the conflicts that created it have become part of rock and roll legend.